At one point in time, Scott Frost was seen as the next big thing in coaching. After becoming one of the most memorable players in college football history and leading Nebraska to a national championship, Scott Frost quickly climbed up the coaching ladder, made a name for himself, had one of the quickest turnarounds in college football history, and was ultimately pegged as the savior to Nebraska's program. The Huskers have fallen on hard times this century, and after the Mike Riley era, they needed a guy who was going to put energy back into the program and bring them back to the glory days. Unfortunately, Scott Frost could not get that done, and went from one of the most beloved figures in Nebraska football history to now one of the most hated. Obviously, you guys probably heard the news, as this morning Scott Frost was fired, and today is the perfect opportunity to take a look at the rise and fall of this coach. We're to talk about his college career, how he rose up the coaching ladder, his time at Nebraska, and why he ultimately failed there. But before we can get started, nearly 80% of you guys are not subscribed, and if you enjoy college football content, be sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like if you want to support what I'm doing here, and turn on notifications so you never miss when I upload. Now let's get started and talk about the tragic downfall of Scott Frost. In order to understand why Frost got fired, we first need to go back in time to the very beginning. Scott Frost was born and raised in Nebraska football territory, and Husker ran in his blood. He was from the Lincoln area and blew up into a big-time high school quarterback. In 4 years as the team's starting quarterback, he threw for 7,000 yards and 67 touchdowns, and also had 4,000 yards and 72 touchdowns on the ground. The dude was a legitimate high school football superstar, but he originally turned his back on the Huskers as he went out to play for Stanford. He was there for the 93 and 94 seasons before he would decide to transfer home and play for coach Tom Osborne. He had a great 95 season with them before he had one of the most memorable seasons in college football history. He became the first Nebraska player and only the 10th player in college football history to both run and pass for over 1,000 yards. He ran for 1,095 yards and had 1,200 yards passing. He also set the school record for rushing touchdowns and yards in a season. The Huskers ended up beating Peyton Manning's Tennessee Volunteers and became the national champions. But this wasn't even the most iconic moment of his career, as most people think about the flea kicker against Mizzou. The Huskers were down and they desperately needed some magic to send this game to overtime. Frost threw the ball and it bounced off a Mizzou player's legs, or the receiver caught it in the end zone and sent it to overtime, where they eventually won and kept their #1 ranking. Frost became very iconic, and nothing could ever make the fan base turn on him, right? Well, at first it didn't look like it was going to be possible, as he went to the NFL as a safety, where he was selected in the 3rd round by the New York Jets. In 4 years in the NFL, he recorded 72 tackles with 1 sack before he would change his career path to coaching. He started out as a graduate assistant at Nebraska before he would become a part of Ron Prince's staff at Kansas State. A year later, he became the linebackers coach at Northern Iowa, where he became the co-defensive coordinator and started to blow up. This would get the attention of big-time programs, as Oregon decided to take a flyer on him, and Chip Kelly made Frost the wide receivers coach for the next 3 years. He helped their offense do great things, and some of his receivers got a chance in the NFL, so Frost was promoted to offensive coordinator when Kelly left, and Mark Helfrich became the head coach. This was a huge era for Oregon football, and he would quickly make a name for himself. He became the primary coach for Marcus Mariota, as he would win the Heisman Trophy, and the Ducks would make the national championship game. Because of that, Frost would become a finalist for the Broyles Award, and his name was a huge buzzword in the college football coaching world. In 2015, Frost coached up Vernon Adams into a star, and he was now going to take on his next challenge, a head coaching job. During Frost's 3 seasons as Oregon's offensive coordinator, the team went 33-8 and finished every season amongst the top 6 in both scoring and total offense. At this time across the country in Orlando, the UCF Knights had fallen on hard times after the Blake Bortles and Brashad Perryman era. They would need a new head man after George O'Leary departed, and they wanted Scott Frost. Frost ended up taking the head coaching job of the Knights and had this to say about it. Quote, "UCF is an excellent opportunity for me because our student athletes can succeed immediately, both competitively and academically. We have had great recent success, and I vividly remember watching the Fiesta Bowl victory. With our student athletes, football staff, facilities, fans, and supporters, I know we will bring exciting and winning football back to Orlando." This would end up happening, and it was a huge step up the coaching ladder for Frost, and his longtime mentor, Tom Osborne, had this to say. Quote, "I know there has been a tremendous amount of interest from schools trying to hire Scott the past couple of years, and I think this will be a good fit for him. He's a guy that is in pretty high demand, and I think he'll do an outstanding job." So yeah, Frost was now the head man at UCF, but how would he do? The previous season, the Knights had gone 0-12, and they would desperately need a turnaround. So how would they do in Frost's first year? Well, Mackenzie Milton would become the new quarterback, Jawan Hamilton would become the top running back, and Traquan Smith would become the star receiver. They would need these guys to step up in a big way, and that is exactly what would happen. He won his first game against South Carolina State before losing to Michigan and Maryland. That Maryland game was in overtime, and that was difficult, but this would lead to 2 wins over Florida International and East Carolina the following 2 weeks. The team was 3-2, and after a 1-point loss to Temple, some were concerned, but then they beat UConn and kept it close on the road against Houston. From there, they ended up beating Tulane before we got his biggest win against Cincinnati. Unfortunately, this team could never really make a lot of momentum, as they ended up losing their final 2 games to Tulsa and South Florida, but the team went 6-6 and was selected to play in the Cure Bowl. In that game, they'd lose to Arkansas State 31-13, and while it was annoying that they did lose, Frost got them back to a bowl in year 1 after they won 0 games last year. People expected UCF to be better in 2017, but not this good. Led once again by star quarterback Mackenzie Milton, the Knights had a superstar at that position. Adrian Killins became one of the best running backs in college football, and Traquan Smith broke out into a superstar. They also had an incredible defense led by the Griffin twins and Pat Jasinski, and combine that with a favorable schedule, UCF had an opportunity to do something special. They killed Florida International in week 1, and then went on the road and destroyed Maryland. Due to the hurricane, they had a couple of games canceled and moved around, but when they finally returned on September 30th, they beat Memphis 40-13. The Tigers were one of the best group of 5 teams, and so far, they are off to a hot start. After that, they went on the road and beat Cincinnati, killed East Carolina, beat Navy, killed Austin Peay, and then survived a close game on the road against SMU. The Knights were now 8-0, and they are now the number 15 ranked team in the country. They go on the road and beat Temple pretty badly before they had what was one of the most iconic games of the entire 2017 season. In their arch rivalry matchup against South Florida, everything was on the line. USF had star players such as Quentin Flowers, Marlon Mack, and Marquez Valdez-Scantling. For some reason, South Florida wasn't ranked, but this game would come down to the wire. It'd go back and forth in the final couple minutes, and after USF tied it up, there was just over a minute to go. The following moment was insane. Star defensive player Mike Hughes would return the kick all the way back for a touchdown, and they'd take a 49-42 lead. From there, Quentin Flowers would throw a pick, and UCF sealed the victory. They ended up climbing up to number 14 for their game against Memphis, and this was the American Championship game. Memphis had star players such as Darrell Henderson, Tony Pollard, and Riley Ferguson, and they made things interesting. The game would end up going to overtime, but UCF would prevail 62-55 in double overtime, winning the American Conference Championship, getting their 12th win, and this made the Scott Frost hype unbelievable. After the game, he was asked about the Nebraska job, and all he said was, "I want to celebrate with my team." There was tons of speculation that Frost was going to take the Nebraska job, but nothing was set in stone just yet. UCF had their miracle 2017 season, and they ended up beating number 7 Auburn 34-27 in the Peach Bowl. The Knights actually claim a national championship from that season, and while it can be debated, there is no debating that the team went 13-0. The Knights had their best season in school history, Mackenzie Milton was a superstar, and Scott Frost was the most sought-after coach in college football. Moving across the country to Lincoln, Nebraska, the Huskers had once again fallen on hard times. After they fired 9-win Bo Pelini, they brought in Mike Riley from Morgan State, and he was not very good. The Huskers had just gone 4-8, and Riley went 19-19 in 3 seasons. But at the time, the Huskers needed a change, and Frost was up to the challenge. The Scott Frost sweepstakes came down to Florida and Nebraska, but obviously the Huskers won his heart, and he decided to take that job. I remember the hype being unbelievable at that time, and I was so excited to see what Frost was going to do there. He said, quote, "It is a great honor and privilege to have the opportunity to return to Nebraska and lead the Huskers football program. I've been fortunate to be at a wonderful school the last 2 years, but Nebraska is a special place with a storied tradition and a fan base which is second to none. I'm truly humbled to be here. The state of Nebraska and Husker program mean a great deal to me, and this is home." UCF would hire Josh Heupel to be their next head coach, and the first thing Frost did at Nebraska was find his quarterback. They offered Tennessee pledge Adrian Martinez, and he'd flip from the Volunteers to the Huskers, and this would become his first starting quarterback. This was the height of the honeymoon phase for Frost in Nebraska, but soon, things would become a horror movie. Going into the 2018 season, Nebraska football obviously had a lot of hype. Many believed they'd make a bowl game, and he would set the tone for the future. Unfortunately, that's not how it would go. He'd have his true freshman quarterback Adrian Martinez, a bona fide star at running back in Divine Ozigbo, and then one of the top receivers in the country in Stanley Morgan Jr. Despite all the talent, Nebraska had a difficult season. Their first game would come against Colorado, and that one was a thriller. Nebraska made a couple of dumb penalties at the end, and Steven Montez found Laviska Shenault for a late touchdown before Nebraska's backup quarterback threw a ball out of the end zone, and they lost 28-33. Colorado was not a very good team, but it was only game 1. Things got rough in week 2, as Nebraska then lost to Troy. After that, they got humiliated by Michigan, before Frost famously said he wanted to play more Indiana schools. Well, luckily, Frost would get his wish, as Purdue came to town the following weekend. How did that go? Well, Purdue won 42-28, and then Nebraska lost to Wisconsin. The Huskers had started out 0-5, and it was a nightmare scenario for him. The hopes of going to a bowl game were pretty much lost, but they at least need to be competitive. They were. They lost 34-31 to Northwestern before they finally won some games. They beat Minnesota 53-28, and then beat Bethune-Cookman. They only lost by 5 on the road against Ohio State, and Adrian Martinez was starting to show his potential. After that, they beat Illinois at home, and then beat Michigan State 9-6. The Huskers had won 4 out of their last 5 games, and they only lost by 3 in their final game against Iowa. So in their last 7 games, they were actually quite competitive and quite a decent football team. Unfortunately though, the team ended up going 4-8 in year 1 under Frost, but this did not stop the hype for 2019. If you're a college football fan, you remember that vividly, as Adrian Martinez was supposed to win the Heisman, Nebraska was supposed to win 10 plus games, and that Nebraska-Ohio State matchup was going to be the game of the year in the Big Ten. How did that one end up going? Well, it did not go well at all. Martinez regressed tremendously, and he lost some of that magic. The Huskers would start the season ranked number 24 in the country before they'd once again lose on the road to Colorado. They had this game won, but they blew it, and Colorado won in overtime. Thankfully, they beat Northern Illinois in Illinois the following 2 weeks to save their record and get to 3-1. Ohio State came to town on September 28th, and in what was supposed to be the game of the year in the Big Ten, became one of the biggest blowouts. Ohio State won 48-7, and this sent Nebraska into oblivion. They would barely survive against Northwestern the following week, and then got killed by Minnesota. The team was now 4-3, but thankfully he had some of those easy Indiana schools to get wins against. That didn't go according to plan either, as they lost to Indiana at home, and then lost by way of a late David Bell touchdown to Purdue. They had dropped another 2 games, and they would continue as they would lose to number 14 Wisconsin, and then number 17 Iowa in their final game. Their only other win of the season came against Maryland, and the Huskers missed the bowl game. They ended up going 5-7, and this was extremely disappointing. The heat would be on Frost for the 2020 season, and he'd have to figure it out quickly. Martinez was back at quarterback, Mills was back at running back, and Wan'Dale Robinson became the top receiver on the team. Unfortunately, because of what went on in the world, the season was kind of whack, but that did not dismiss the poor play Nebraska had. They lost to Ohio State in week 1, then lost to Northwestern. They got one of their biggest wins of the Frost era against Penn State, but this ended up being one of the worst Penn State teams in recent memory before they lose to Illinois and Iowa. Nebraska would get their next win on the road against Purdue before they'd lose to Minnesota and finish the year with a win against Rutgers. Frost went 3-5 in year 3, and the only reason he got a pass was because of everything going on in the world, and once again, there was supposed to be potential for 2021. This is where things get real interesting, as Nebraska literally became the best losing team ever. Led by 4th-year starter Adrian Martinez, running back Ramir Johnson, and Montana transfer Samori Toure at receiver, the Huskers had a decent amount of talent, and there was reason for optimism. As we all know though, that goes away quickly when Frost is the coach. They lost their week 0 matchup against Illinois, and this set the tone for the season. It was a 1-possession game. They beat Fordham and Buffalo in week 2 and week 3, before they'd have a game on the road against Oklahoma. This game was close, but they ended up losing 23-16 in the renewed rivalry game. After that, they were beating Michigan State on the road late, before Jaden Reed returned a touchdown, and then Sparty won in overtime. They beat the rails off of Northwestern the following week, before they lost 6 straight close games. The first one came against Michigan at night, as there was a late fumble and Michigan kicked a game-winning field goal. Then they had Minnesota, in which they lost by 7 on the road. Then there was Purdue, in which they lost by 5 at home. There was Ohio State, which they kept close but lost by 9. And then they lost by 7 against Wisconsin. The most heartbreaking loss of the season though was their final game against number 16 Iowa, as they were leading the entire game before they blew a 4th quarter lead and lost 28-21. Somehow Frost's team put up more points than they allowed, but ended up going 3-9. By many, they're considered the best 3-9 team ever, and it became a joke. Scott Frost could not catch a break, and his team could not figure out how to win football games. They weren't really that bad, but again, they couldn't win. Some speculated that Frost would be fired, but instead, he was extended. It was going to be his make-or-break 2022 season, and he had to figure it out now, or he was going to be fired. He brought in Mark Whipple, who coached up Kenny Pickett at Pittsburgh, brought in Mickey Joseph from LSU, and a plethora of transfers came in. Adrian Martinez left for Kansas State, and Casey Thompson and Chuba Purdy both transferred in. They brought in a transfer running back by the name of Anthony Grant, and then Trey Palmer and Marcus Washington were brought in at receiver. Their first game would come against Northwestern in Ireland, and this game was terrible. After a great first drive, Nebraska could not stop Northwestern's offense, and when it came time to make a big play at the end, Casey Thompson threw a pick, and they lost their first game, which was another close game. This caused many to mentally pull the plug on Frost, but maybe if they had strong showings in their next 2 games, he could save his job with wins there, and maybe by beating Oklahoma. How would that go from there? Well, they were losing to North Dakota for most of the game before they put it on in the second half, and then this past weekend, they were favored by 3 touchdowns against Georgia Southern. Led by Clay Helton, the Eagles were not supposed to win this game, but they went toe-to-toe with Nebraska and eventually scored a game-winning touchdown. Nebraska would have an opportunity with a field goal, but it would go wide left and they would lose. Nebraska had now started at 1-2, Frost had lost to Georgia Southern, and Frost had finally lost Nebraska. This morning, it was announced that he was going to be fired and Mickey Joseph would be promoted to interim head coach. The Nebraska administration said, quote, "Earlier today I met with Coach Frost and informed him we are making a change in leadership of our football program. This is effective immediately. Scott has poured his heart and soul into the Nebraska football program, both as a quarterback and as a head coach, and I appreciate his work and dedication." So why did Scott Frost end up failing at Nebraska? Well, one, he couldn't win games. I know that's an obvious statement, but it's very true. He went 16-31 in 4.5 years, never made a bowl game, and never finished higher than 5th in the Big Ten West. It's not like the Big Ten West is a juggernaut either. Frost struggled against bad teams at home, could not beat the bottom dwellers of the Big Ten, and never beat a ranked team. He never had good quarterback play, as besides a couple of games from Adrian Martinez, he was very inconsistent, and you need a good quarterback to win. The Huskers did not recruit at the level that many believed they could. Special teams is always an issue, the defense never could get it together, and he went through so many different coordinators and coaches. He was always promising big results, talking smack to other coaches, and he could never back it up. It always seemed there was a new way to lose, and when a fan base suffers a ton of heartbreaking losses, they're more likely to want to move on from a guy. It's one thing to get blown out, but it's another to have your heartstrings pulled. This has happened about 10 to 15 times over the last 2 years, and most of the time it resulted in a loss. Yes, Nebraska was more competitive over the last 2 seasons, but again, it didn't translate to wins, and there was always a new way to lose. What many people are wondering now is how Scott Frost did so well at UCF. He had a good quarterback, had a good culture, and won a lot of big games. Some say he just inherited the talent before him, and others say he was just under too much pressure at Nebraska. It's probably a mix of somewhere in the middle, but either way, I hope the best for Scott Frost. I think at heart he is a good dude, and with what he contributed to college football back in the 90s, I want to see the guy succeed. A lot of people like to hate and poke fun at Nebraska, but I would thoroughly enjoy seeing Nebraska get back to being good. It's always better when those big brands are good, and those fans care so much there. It's sad to see what has happened to the Nebraska program, and I honestly don't know what they're going to do next for a coaching hire. I'll probably make a video later in the week discussing that, but for now, Frost's legacy at Nebraska has been ruined. This is really sad to see, and I hope the best for him moving forward. But what do you guys think? If you're a Nebraska fan, what went wrong for Scott Frost? What are your expectations for the future? And who should you guys hire as the next coach? Be sure to let me know down below. Leave a like if you want to support today's video, and check out all my other videos on the end screen. Hope to see you guys again soon, but until next time, peace.